There's a water from this one.
Somebody get some water. James, they're going to be okay. James, stay with us.
These pigeons.
Everywhere we go, it's getting someone in power.
We're gonna need more wood. We need to dry these clothes before we catch our dad.
We're starting to fight. How can we ever go back there again? We should stay here in Ria for the time being.
Talk about it later.
Yeah, but just one more second, okay? Easy, easy.
James, we're going to be okay.
Oh, what does it mean?
Is he bleeding anywhere else? Andrew, check his leg. Is he bleeding then? The bleeding's not stopping.
What's going on? What is it mean?
Hey!
That was an example of a captivating introduction. How many of you have seen that already? You saw it? And all right.
The actual.
That episode.
Oh, that one there.
That episode. Okay. What happened to James? We don't know. Yeah, if you haven't seen that episode, you don't know what happened to James. But don't you have in your mind wondering, what happened to James? What I want to talk about is the switch technique. S, again, is set the scene, okay? When that video first started, what was the scene like? What was the first thing we saw in that video? Before the people came in, what was there? What?
It was an accident or something?
Before they came in.
Sorry.
There was silence. There was a table, candlelight. It was silent and serene. Okay, they set the scene, nice, silent, quiet, serene type scene. And then came the twist. ¿Qué están buscando ustedes? ¿Será con Samuel?
Con Samuel.
Ok. ¿Le puede ayudar? Muy bien. Él le puede ayudar. Okay. And then came the twist. All of a sudden, all the people came in, and what did you notice? What did you notice as the people came in? All of a sudden, there was chaos, there was stress, there was tension, and Big James had a big old bruise on his head. You know, it went from serene and calm and cool to all of a sudden there's all this tension. Yet they built up intrigue because by the end of that introduction, you can't help but ask yourself, what happened to James? Why does he have this big old bruise? And they're talking, oh, what does this mean? What happened? How can we go back there? And you can't help but wonder, what happened? This is something that TV shows do on a pretty regular basis. They can't do it with every episode, but whenever they do it, it really builds up intrigue. It makes people wonder what happened. I've seen stuff like this in many TV shows, like the opening scene, the good guy is being arrested. And I'm like, wow, he's the good guy. Why is he being arrested? What did he do? Or did he do it? Or was he framed? I remember one show I saw, one of the good guy wakes up, the phone rings and it wakes him up, and the bad guy talks and says, hello, sunshine. He's like, where am I? Look around. He turns the cell phone around. He's in a coffin. He's buried alive. And can't help but wonder how he got there. How'd they catch him? What are they doing? And the whole episode was that his friends had to get something done in order for them to tell him where he was, to be able to get him out of that coffin and save his life. And the whole thing was very tense, yet it just builds up intrigue. This is something that many preachers don't do. to be honest. And it's something that I've never done because I just learned about this recently, but I did it in the updated introduction that I gave you last week. Last week, if you remember the introduction I started with, I felt like Indiana Jones. And what was I doing? What was happening in that introduction where I felt like Indiana Jones?
The ball?
Is like Indiana on the huge ball, except I was running toward the ball. I'm talking about this really tense scene, but that wasn't the chronological beginning. This episode that we just saw, that scene was not the chronological beginning of the episode. After the song and stuff, then they go back like a week before or 3 days before. And a lot of TV episodes do that. They'll start with this tension where you're wondering, but how did they get there? And then the next scene after their theme song or whatever, a week ago, 48 hours ago, a month ago, or whatever, then they start with the chronological beginning. But the reason they do that, because there's no real tension at that chronological beginning. Well, if you start with the tension, you get people's attention. That's why last week I started with the tension of when I was in college, but the actual chronological beginning of my story was when I was in elementary school. I learned how to play soccer, but there was no tension there, so I didn't start there. This is something that if TV producers and actors and all that can do that, we can do the same thing. Setting the scene, again, is one of the most important things you should do when you first get the mic. And there's different ways of doing it. One, if there's no tension, start with the part that has the tension and lead up to the tension and not explain why that tension is there exactly, and then go back. That's what I did last week. You can't do that every time. I haven't done it yet, except last week. I haven't done an actual inner preaching yet because it's something I just learned recently, something I realized recently that TV episodes do that a lot, and it works. Other ways to help set the scene is to describe the character's feelings, the main character's feelings, his thoughts, without really telling who he is, still leaving some room for intrigue. Or describe what's happening and some tension or something exciting that's happening, but yet leaving out some details. I usually leave out the details of who the main character is when I first start, usually, because that helps not only to set the scene, but then also to build intrigue, which is the next thing I want to talk about, is the I in Switch, which is intrigue. Ways to infuse intrigue. Mm-hmm. Huh?
You want to move that?
Not yet. I mean, I got looking here and I'm looking there. It's like I'm very technical. Woo.
I know your summer heavy.
He helped me,
Here.
yes.
Oh, he's here.
All right. Like this scene that we had just seen, it gets intrigue because you can't help but wonder what happened to James. And I myself was thinking in the Bible, I don't know of anything in the Bible that happened to James having a big old lump on his forehead. Yeah. What happened to James? And things that you can do to help to bring up that intrigue is to leave out certain details. A lot of times I leave out the detail of who I'm talking about. To leave out some type of detail so that people will think, who's he talking about? Or what is he talking about? Somehow leave out some pertinent details. Don't just tell them everything up front. Leave out some type of detail so people will actually wonder what you're talking about and be curious, and they'll pay more attention. Okay? Talk about a person without mentioning who he is first, or talk about a situation without mentioning exactly what it is at first, but describing it, and describing it in vivid language. Okay? The W is, again, that's weave in wackiness. That's basically to bring in humor. That's the only one of these elements I would say that's not necessary, but it's good when you can get it. In this situation, in this introduction, there was no humor, but yet it had intrigue. It had people wondering what happened. It had me wondering what happened, and I definitely wanted to see the rest of the episode. Thinking back to last week when I did the introduction of my personal story there, I weaved in some wackiness. I put in some humor. Like when I kicked the ball, tried to kick it forward, and it went backwards.
I think the part of humor, I mean, a lot of pastors do it, and sometimes they abuse of that. I think also we have to be careful with what we abuse of those hoods. Outside, I know some people are napper. It was a snapper.
You know, Eduardo, when he says something.
Este es natural para humor.
I sometimes not.
Nah, ain't no sometimes.
But-
I'm gonna
but-
talk about him.
But the thing when you try to abuse that, and even in myself, I have realized, hey, be careful, we don't abuse.
How would you explain abusing it or give an example? What would you mean?
Abuse like the
becomes the-
center
he becomes the
of the
center.
message should be Jesus Christ. When you try to get attention in you or in your on this and lose this focus, I think we're abused.
Okay,
think
I would agree with that.
because obviously we have 40 minutes, 30 minutes. And you probably 2-3 minutes, okay, get it right here. But when it's a constant thing, it's hard. You know, and that's why I try to also. I want to use the word balance because balance also is
I think the break besides war is more discerning, you know, in the people.
When I was going to church immediately, but the pastor, it was so much wackiness or comic that I almost felt like I was at a stand-up comedy show, and I didn't appreciate that because I
Okay.
think that's.
It can, it can be too much. You can not have it at all, and it'll still be a very good introduction. You know, and you can have some, you know, and usually when you have some, it usually makes it better, but sometimes it's just, there's no place you can put it. I've done introductions with no humor because I couldn't figure out any way to do it, to get any humor in there, and I've done introductions with humor.
Sometimes
Yes.
it's like, okay, you're not funny. But no, but there are people that they are.
All right. And then next, T, taking twists and turns. This is really good to help and build up intrigue and curiosity and having people want to listen to what you're saying. They did it, as you can see, because I started real calm and serene, and then all of a sudden, all the people start bursting in, and one of them's injured, and it's a twist and it's a turn, and it makes you think, wait up, what happened? And I believe every introduction should have a twist or a turn. Writers have said that a story without a twist is not worth telling. Now, I don't fully agree with that. I believe that in the introduction, your story should have a twist. Later on, we'll see in the body, you can tell some stories that don't have twists and they'll still be very good. And I'll talk about why in a little bit later. But I believe you should always have some type of twist. If you have a story in your introduction, or we're going to talk about later on in another class about some introductions that are not stories but have story elements, I believe one of those elements should always be a twist. There should always be intrigue and a twist. The wackiness or humor does not always have to be there. But the intrigue or the twist, I believe, should always be there if you really want to captivate attention. Again,
Sorry. Could you elaborate about what the twist is?
a twist is something that's unexpected. I'll talk about like last week when I started talking about how I felt like Indiana Jones and with the ball rolling out. Yet I was running toward the ball, and then you find out I'm just talking about a soccer ball that I had to kick. You know, that's one twist. But then another twist I did last week, I talked about how my friend was saying that how I must be teaching them what not to do because he saw that I was not good as a soccer player. And then the twist was he asked how much wisdom he had because sometimes the person who is the worst example can give you the best lesson and the most impactful lesson. And that seems crazy because we all know that actions speak louder than words. So that in itself is a twist. You know, how is it that someone that's a horrible example is going to be my best teacher? But then I explained with, and all that. Something that's unexpected.
Even the Holy Spirit bring those twists when you're praying your sermons, and when you're say, I never seen this way, and then those twists that the Holy Spirit given on the thing, we bring on the sermon, you know, but it's like those revelations.
Yes.
The Holy Spirit, the way you started.
Yep. I believe it was the Holy Spirit that led me to
Yeah.
change my whole introduction.
Yeah.
That third Sunday that the church had gone to the Dominican Republic that first time. Okay. Twists. Some ways to be able to get a twist is to say something that seems to go against common sense. Now, I started out a sermon once. Did you know there's no such thing as cold? And that, people are like, there's no such thing as cold. And actually, that's what scientists say. And the scientists will tell you cold does not exist. There's no such thing. Okay? Which seems to go against common sense. But then I helped explain why and then related it to what I was going to be talking about. But that was a way to get a twist at the very beginning. Another thing is to talk about something that seems to go against the Bible. Talk about something that seems to go against scientific laws, something that seems to not make sense, but you can explain, and then people say, okay, now I know what he's talking about. Now I understand. But at first it's like, what? Those are good ways to get twists, to have an unexpected application to your introduction. I'm going to give another example of an introduction today where that was the main twist, the unexpected application. The story is already known, but how I told them I would apply that story was what was unexpected. All right. Here we've been working this. Yeah, there we go. That intrigue. And then if you do all that, after you do that, the last thing to do is to compel them to continue listening by asking them questions that should already be in their mind. Like in the video example we just saw, the question that was in my mind was like, what happened to James? Now, they couldn't put that in the video and have someone ask, what happened to James? But that's something you can't help but ask. But that's something, when you're preaching and you're giving an introduction, you can end your introduction asking questions. Like, again, last week in the introduction I gave, I talked about this destructive habit and just how destructive it was without ever telling what the habit was. Again, building up intrigue. And then the questions I ended with, what is this habit? How can it have so much power over someone who's been saved, sanctified, filled with the Holy Ghost? How exactly does it work? Why is it so dangerous? And then this is what we'll be learning today. And basically making people realize, I need to listen. After already building up the intrigue, then letting them know that you're going to answer the questions that they're already thinking about. And then they want to listen. Okay? And it compels them to listen. And that is actually the best way to end your introduction, is with questions that you tell them that you're going to answer during the sermon body. And if you do all that, then H is not something you do, it's something you get. You have them hooked for the whole sermon. And the reason that they will be hooked for the whole sermon then, well, there we go, set the scene, weave and wackiness, infuse it with intrigue, take twists and turns, compel them to continue listening, and then you'll have them hooked for the whole sermon. And one of the reasons that works, there we go, is something that's kind of based on Newton's first law of motion. Who knows what Newton's first law of motion is?
Stays in motion. What does in motion stays in motion?
A body in motion tends to stay in motion, and a body at rest tends to stay at rest. And that's basically how they get clocks to work for such a long time, is they get the pendulum to start swinging, and it'll just keep on swinging as long as there's no friction against the pendulum. It'll stay in motion. That's why they put it in a case and don't try to let any air get to it. But some air will get to it, and after a while it will stop swinging and you'll have to adjust it. But it works for a long time because a body at rest, a body in motion tends to stay in motion, and a body at rest tends to stay in rest. Well, what I've learned, let me see. I call Valentine's first law of captivity. And it's a mind engaged in thinking and wondering will tend to stay engaged. And a mind disengaged will tend to stay disengaged. And what that means basically is if you can captivate their attention at the beginning, it's easy to keep their attention throughout the whole sermon. If you don't captivate their attention at the beginning, it's not impossible to get their attention later. It's just harder. It's not impossible. I've been in many sermons where the introduction really didn't get my attention, but then later on they started saying things that really got my attention and I listened. It's just harder, that's all. And this is something I learned in that time, that the first time we went to, or you guys went to the Dominican Republic. What I basically learned is if I would captivate their attention with my introduction, God would captivate their hearts with his word. And that's what I felt God did. See, he led me to captivate their attention with the introduction, and then he captivated their hearts with his word, which is something that we as preachers, we can't really do. But we can work on the introduction, work on our points in the body and all that, and God can captivate their hearts with his word. Okay? Before I go any further, all of this started December 2018. I was on vacation in Puerto Rico, and I watched this video. And this video is not specifically about preaching, it's about public speaking. And I started thinking about some of the things he talked about, the bad things or poor ways that speakers will start their speeches. And I was thinking about, I do that when I preach. And that's not really a good practice, I can tell. And I should change. But then, the first time I preached after seeing this video was at a men's meeting, and I didn't put into practice what he said to do. And the next time was the first week that you guys went to the Dominican Republic, and I didn't put it into practice. And the next time was the second week, and I didn't put it into practice. And then when I was preparing for that third week sermon, I mentioned this last time, I just felt that the sermon was just weak, that the body of the message was weaker than the second week. Like the first week was good, the second week was better, and the third week it was like, I was like, it didn't pop. It didn't have any oomph. It wasn't bad. I mean, it was biblically based, and it was I thought it was sound teaching, but just, I don't know, it was just, like it needed something. It was like, it's just, And I realized I needed to change my introduction. And then I remembered this video, and then I rewatched it and watched some other videos. Basically, I had an idea of what to start with my introduction with, and I looked for a video on that. And none of the ones I saw I liked, all of them just, And I felt God led me to tell a story in a way that I'd never done before, with what now I call the switch technique. But I'd never done it before, and so I was really nervous. But I want to show you this video so you can understand where I'm coming from.
The first words you should say in a speech, and what are the last words you should say in a speech? Now, tomorrow, I don't know how many of you are speaking, but I guarantee if you go to conferences, 19 out of 20 speakers will start in one of these ways. Number one, my name is Connor Neal. I'm from Tango, and this talk is about the latest trend in monitoring strategies. Now, all of you are sitting with a piece of paper in front of you that says, I'm Connor Neal, I've come from Ireland, and I'm going to talk about Tango 04 and this. So, by repeating what you already know, I'm giving a signal that it's a time to get your BlackBerry out. I've just signaled that this talk is opportunity to reconnect with BlackBerry, make sure the office is okay, maybe get some plans together for the weekend. Another way to start.
All right. I saw that and I was thinking, that's how I start my sermons. I start, hi, I'm Valentine. I'm not the pastor. I always want them to know, I want them to know I'm not the pastor. I'm a Bible teacher here. And, a pastor, either they're out on a mission trip or for whatever reason he asked me to preach. And I was realizing, after he said that and I thought that, who doesn't know that when I get up there? There might be some first-time visitors that don't know that. But most people already know, I'm Valentine, I'm not the pastor, I'm a Bible teacher here. And by telling you what you already know, I'm telling you, it's like I'm sending a signal that I'm not going to tell you anything new. And most preachers do that. And I was like, he's got a point. I always do that. And so later on, the first time, now when I preach, and since that third week that you guys went to the Dominican Republic, I don't start like that anymore. Now I start with a story. There was one exception where I did not start with a story, which we'll get to that later. Okay, but I realized that by doing that, telling who you are, why you're preaching, all that, most people already know that. And you're not grabbing their attention. And it doesn't mean that it's impossible to grab their attention afterward. It's just that studies have been showing that if you don't grab the people's attention within the first minute, some of them, they'll be gone and they'll never.
So you did like an intro, then you made the presentation of the new visitor. I think you did something like that.
That's what I always do. That's what I do.
Then you call the new one. I'm pray. I remember.
Yes, I do my introduction usually with a story, and then at the end of the introduction, and I normally do the questions, and then I pray and welcome visitors, do any prayer petitions and any announcements, anything like that, after I had their attention.
I thought Valentin took a very strong Puerto Rican coffee you wanted.
Bustelo, eso está bueno.
I remember you did that.
Okay.
I remember.
Yes, and I learned that from him. And he's not even a preacher. But I was like, that would probably work. And I was nervous to try that because I'd never seen anything. Well, I have seen other people do it, but I didn't really notice. And I noticed it worked from the feedback I got and everything, that it had worked very well. But then he talks about some other things. There's the other way people start.
The mic's working. How much time have I got? Okay. Right. Okay. Is it plugged in? And you laugh, but I guarantee tomorrow there's going to be some moments that get a little of that. And why? Because this is, for some of you, the first time you see this individual. They're here as a leader in their industry. And your kid at school presenting on giraffes does a better job. I'm sad. So I think there's only...
Yeah. And again, now in this church, we don't have that problem because Sam and the media people are very good about making sure everything's working, and we don't do all that. But I started thinking, what are some other ways that we just take attention away from grabbing that attention? And there are things like presenting the visitors and doing prayer requests and all that they're not bad to do. In fact, that should be done. But it's better I think it would be better to leave that after the introduction. And that's what I started thinking. But the first 2 times I preached, I didn't, because that was just totally new. Even though I thought about it, like, it just seemed weird. But I thought about it. And then he talks about what he thinks are only 3 good ways to start a speech.
Of starting a speech. And it's the same if you went into a bar and there's a group of people, as a networking event.
Don't go in no
like
bar. No le quiero ver ahí.
Into this room. And maybe I came into
Okay,
the
está
room.
bien, está.
The 3 people are having a little conversation. I walk in and I say, hi, I'm Connor. I'm Irish, 38 years old. I have an interest in sailing. I like running. And they've walked away. So how do you get people to engage with you when you're networking? I say, in networking, the best thing you can do is walk up. I think we know someone in common. Try and walk away when someone comes up and says that to you. Hopefully you've done your research so you do know that you know someone in common, but with LinkedIn, you can find out who knows who on anyone you want. So, how to start a speech? First way, with a question that matters to the audience. How do you phrase a problem that the audience faces in a question? So that'd be the third best way of starting a speech. The second best way of starting a speech
Well, before he,
is with a factoid that shocks.
well, before he, what he says is the third best way to start a speech is with a question that matters to the audience. I didn't do that, in the first time I started this new style of preaching, but I don't know if it was the second or third time, I put questions that would matter to the audience at the end of the introduction, like I did last week. What is this habit? Why is it so destructive? And I've realized, wow, this was really powerful, and it really helped get the people to want to listen. And so what I've learned is that to ask questions that matter to the audience is the best way to end your introduction. Now, you shouldn't start the introduction with that, but rather you can, and like he said, it would be a good way, but it's not the best way. There's better ways to start, and then the best way to end the introduction is with questions that matter to the audience that you've already built up the intrigue for. And the second way was a
There's
factoid
more
that
people
shocks,
alive today
like this one.
than have ever died.
That's weird.
More people alive today than have ever died. So there's a lot of speeches that can follow on from there. Every 2 minutes, the energy reaching the earth from the sun is equivalent to the whole annual usage of humanity. All the energy, all the cars, everything moving, all the lighting, all the air conditioning of the world in 1 year is equivalent to 2 minutes of sun. Does that change how you think about energy? So, what's a fact that shocks the audience into rethinking? And Google has transformed your ability to get at these facts. Given 2 or 3 minutes, you can find out, one, whether anything I've said is true, but you trust me because I looked the part and I'm from ESA. Those are, in fact, 2 true facts. I usually get someone come up to me at the end, are you sure? How do they measure dead and alive? But it's true. And it's not even close. The best way to start a speech, and the way...
All right. A factoid that shocks. I've started sermons like that. Well, I started one like that. And again, my first line was, did you know there's no such thing as cold? Cold does not exist. And that's like, why were we, what? Cold? And I went through it, and then I actually followed up with elements that is like a story, but wasn't exactly a story. Like if you take a scientist to Mount Everest, he's still gonna say there's no such thing. If you take him to the South Pole to study penguins, he's still gonna say there's no such thing as cold. And then explain why and what had to do with what I was going to preach on that day, and how we should have a certain type of belief about something else that a lot of people think exists that we should realize really doesn't exist for us. Which I'm probably going to give that example when I get into the non-story ways that are still good ways to start an introduction. But that is also a very good way to start an introduction if you don't have exactly a story, but you know of some kind of fact that people is like, what? And it's just a really surprising fact. And you know how you can relate it to the Bible or what you want to teach on that day. Okay, but then now comes the best way to start a speech, which was also the best way to start a sermon.
All use from now forward is the same way we start a story to a child. Now, how do we start a story to a child? Érase una vez.
Érase una vez.
Once upon a time.
El irlandés hablando
What happens when
español.
you say once upon a time? I can tell you what happens when I say once upon a time. My daughter leans forward, gets ready to hear, engages. And we were all trained as kids to know when a story's coming. We also know when a teacher is about to deliver a 40-minute boring lecture that has no impact on our lives.
Eso, maestros.
But in business, you don't hear Jack Welch saying once upon a time. Steve Jobs doesn't start his speeches once upon a time. So there's a grown-up way of saying once upon a time. And if you listen to the conversations that are interesting around you at a dinner table, in a networking event, if you listen to the people that are gathering the group of 8 that are listening to them, the way they're talking is different. The way they start is different. The way you tell stories as an adult is, in October, was the last time I was in this room. There were 120 people in the room, and I was having a new conversation with one of the world experts on public speaking. And he said something to me. He said something to me that's had me thinking ever since. He said something to me that changed what I think about what's important in speaking. Now I can pause for about 30 seconds, 2-3 minutes. And you want to know what he said?
Okay. What he just did there was a few of the elements of the switch technique. First thing he did is talk about in October of last year, I was in this room and I started talking with this man who knows a lot about public speaking. He started setting the scene. First he told where he was, what he was doing, and then he built up intrigue. And he says something to me that changed the way I think about public speaking. He says something, but he didn't tell you what he said. And you can't help but wonder, what did the man say? He built up, and that was a very short story. That was, I don't know, a minute, 2 minutes or whatever. And yet he built up intrigue that people who are interested in public speaking would want to know, what the man say? And that's how to start a sermon as well. The best way to start usually is with a story where you build up intrigue. I usually have some type of twist, something that's unexpected. And that's, again, how this whole thing started with me. But I didn't start putting it into practice until I saw that third sermon was just, I felt like it was going to be a letdown and a disappointment, and that I had to change, and I had to change the introduction. I felt God leading me to do so. And so that's what I started doing. And then, there we go. Because of that, this is now what I don't do when I first get the mic. And again, it's not that you can't do it, because you can, it'll just make getting their introduction harder. This makes keeping the people's attention, not introduction, keeping the people's attention easier. So when I first get the mic, I don't say hello, and I don't introduce myself. There was one exception, which when I get to different types of introduction, I'll tell you why there was an exception. I don't welcome the visitors. I don't make any announcements. I don't even pray. I'm a sinner. But actually, I do all those things, but when do I do them? After the introduction, after I have everyone's attention, after people feel compelled to listen to what I have to say, then Valentin's law of captivation comes into play, where they're already engaged, so they're going to stay engaged. Even if they're not really interested in maybe whether I'm going to announce or whatever, they're still going to stay engaged. Okay, and that's why I do that. And I started that since that time with only, okay. And so there are a lot of different types of captivating introductions. Most of them are with stories. The first one, they're not in any particular order. The first one we're going to talk about is the personal story. That's how I started last week's class. The personal story, how I learned how to play soccer as a child, but then stopped playing for so many years that when my best friend, captain of the soccer team, kicked the ball to me, I didn't even know what to do with it. And I was all embarrassed. And then he started making fun of me when I became a soccer coach, telling me I must be teaching the children what not to do. But then how that actually was very wise, because someone who is an absolute horrible example can be the best teacher of what you should not do. And how I learned not to smoke from people who were smoking for years and seeing the results, like, whoo. And then I got into what I was going to be talking about, that we're going to be talking about a habit that I've been practicing. And it'll ruin your life if you practice it, you know, and all the bad effects that will happen without ever telling what the habit was, you know, until after the introduction I would tell, and you're building up that intrigue and giving a personal story. But there's a challenge. I want to go back. One of the things we talked about with a personal story, or with a story, why it's so powerful, two of the things was co-creation. The person who's hearing a story, if they're interested in the story, they'll start creating the story themselves in their mind. They'll create it with you. And so they're engaged along with you. Even though they may not be saying anything, may not be moving, doing it, they're actually actively engaged in creating that story. The other thing was coupling. Coupling is that scientists have done studies where they put electrodes on people's brains, one that was telling a story, and those who were listening to the story, and so that their brain waves linked up. And they had the same exact brain waves. There's a connection between them that seemed supernatural. To me, it seemed like a superpower. However, this challenge, if you do not do well with this challenge, a personal story will become your kryptonite. Okay? A personal story, if a story, any kind of story will connect you with the audience, and that's like in a supernatural way almost, it seemed like a superpower, then a personal story about what you've gone through to people who've gone through the same thing, that would then be a super duper connector, a super duper power. Yet, there's a challenge that if you don't overcome this challenge, instead of you having a super duper power, it'll be like kryptonite to you. What does kryptonite do to Superman? It makes him totally weak. It makes him totally defeatable. If you do not overcome this challenge, you will not connect with the audience. Not only will you not connect with them, you will alienate them, and you will make them not want to listen to you. Notice how I'm also building up intrigue, because you want to, what is this challenge? That's something you should do not only into the introduction, but in your body of your sermon, whenever you can. Build up intrigue. That challenge is sometimes people don't like to be vulnerable. When you tell a story, if you're telling stories and you tell stories quite a bit, personal stories, and you're never vulnerable, what I mean by that, you never tell about how you did wrong and how you messed up and how you had to suffer these consequences and how hard-headed you were. And how you learn from that, from being hard-headed and from doing things wrong. Let me tell you what I mean. When Carolina and I first got married, when we came back from our honeymoon, we were going to a church in Carrollton. When we came back from our honeymoon, we found out that they opened a satellite church in Mesquite, which was much closer to us. So we decided we'd go there and check it out. They needed musicians, so Carolina wanted to go there. The preacher at the very beginning there was a pastor there, but for some reason, he wasn't preaching. At first, the guy who was preaching was one of the sons of the pastor of the church in Carrollton. And he would tell stories every week. He'd tell some personal stories, this and that. And every time he told a story about how he did something, it was always him doing it right and all the other Christians, how they do this wrong. And how, just everything was always him. It's like he always did everything right. And it made me feel like he thought he was way up here and we were way down here. It made me feel like he thought he was just so much better than us because he never talked. It's like he never did anything wrong. And I'm like, he ain't all that. And it alienated me. And whereas a story would normally connect you with the audience, it totally alienated me. I did not want to listen to that man preach anymore. I was like, when is the pastor going to start preaching? Because I do not want to listen to this man anymore. I hated listening to him preach. And he told personal stories. But I guess he felt that challenge that he didn't want to be vulnerable, because it's not easy to be vulnerable, to tell people some of the faults that you've done and some of the struggles that you've had, and that I've had to, in sermons, I've had to say, I still struggle with this. I know pastor does that also. He talks about, and that's what a lot of preachers, you'll hear them say, I'm preaching to me first. And I believe it because I've done that. I gave a sermon on anger. I still struggle with anger. I even put a mirror up. I was like, this is more for me than for you guys. But for some reason, I feel like God is helping me through this. And I'm hoping it can help you guys also. But I'm still struggling with this. It's not like I got it all together. And so for some people, that's a challenge. They don't want to be vulnerable. And if you're not, and every story you tell is always you the man, it will have the exact opposite effect as what a story would normally have. It will alienate the people, and people won't want to listen to you. I remember I did not want to listen to that preacher anymore. Okay, so don't do that. Okay, then there's biblical stories. Biblical stories have a challenge. It's like, how can you tell a well-known biblical story and put in twists? Twists, again, are something that's unexpected. If everyone already knows the story, how are you going to build up intrigue? How are you going to have a twist? They already know what the story is all about. And that's a challenge. And that's what I want to give you an example. That was actually the first time I did the switch technique. The first time I did what I consider a captivating introduction was with a very well-known biblical story. Mm-hmm. And basically I started like this. Imagine this scene with me, if you would. There's a battlefield. On one side, there's a challenging king. On the other side, the champion king. And the champion king has already defeated the challenging king. But the challenging king, he's slick. He has a new secret weapon. So he sends word to the champion king, and he tells him, let's not do all this where we send out all our army, and there's all this fighting and all this killing, and then they're all day and all night and all that bloodshed. Man, ain't nobody got time for all that. I'll tell you what, let's do this. You send out your best warrior, I'll send out my best warrior. They'll fight to the death. Bada bing, bada boom, it'll be over. And the nation of the one that wins will lord over the nation that lost. Now, the champion king, he liked this idea because dude was a fierce warrior, okay? Literally head and shoulders above any other warrior he'd ever faced. And so he was like, all right, we'll do this. Let's do this. And I'll see your warrior on the battlefield. And there he is getting ready. He warming up. But then the scene changed. Enter Goliath, over 9.5 feet tall. And he wasn't no string bean. Dude was thick. The Bible doesn't tell us how much he weighed because people didn't weigh themselves back then. But the Bible tells us how much his armor and his weapons weighed to show us that he was extremely strong. Now, Bible scholars have calculated that in order for him to be that tall and that strong, he had to weigh at least 750 pounds. And so when King Saul saw him, he was like, Mr. Oh, I see your champion on the battlefield. He was like, I'll see you later. And he was out. And to Goliath, send out a man to fight me. And for 40 days, he challenged Saul and everyone in his army. For 40 days, he mocked Saul and everyone in his army. For 40 days, he mocked the God of heaven and earth. 40 days. But then the scene changed again. Enter the shepherd boy. And when I say boy, I'm not exaggerating. David was just a teenager, not even old enough to be in the military yet. He was just a boy. And at that time, Bible scholars tell us that the average height of a full-grown man was between 5'4" to 5'5". David was not full-grown yet. Also, David had not been in the army yet, so he probably didn't have a big muscular build either. So here we have Goliath, over 9.5 feet tall. David, probably not even 5.5 feet tall. Goliath, 750 pounds of pure muscle. David, maybe 100 pounds. Can you imagine this scene? But then it gets worse. David was cute. The Bible tells us what Goliath thought when he saw David. It said that he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy, which means red-headed or reddish hair, and good-looking. That's not a warrior. That's some teeny bopper's junior prom date. Oh, did you hear who Susie's going to the prom with? Oh no, with who? David. David? Yeah, he's redheaded and cute. That's not a warrior. Israel was supposed to send out their fiercest warrior. And they send out a pretty boy. What were they thinking? And you see, on both sides of the battlefield, on one side, a huge beast of a man with weapons of warfare. Ah, yeah, there was the weapons also. To make things worse, as if things could get any worse, there were the weapons. Goliath had armor, a shield, a sword, javelins, arrows. David had a sling and a stick. What was David thinking? That is the point. David's thinking. David was thinking differently than every other man in Israel's camp. They were all thinking, whoa, look how big Philistine's secret weapon is. Whoa, look how strong the Philistine's secret weapon is. Whoa, look how intimidating the secret weapon is. But David, he had his own secret weapon, his mindset, his thinking. He was thinking, the enemy may be huge, but my God is huger. The enemy may be strong, but my God is stronger. The enemy may have superior weapons, but it is not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. And David took up his sling, wound up his sling, and he said, you come to me with a sword and a spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord. Take that. And boom. Goliath stumbled. Goliath mumbled. And like the walls of Jericho, Goliath crumbled. David's secret weapon, his mindset, defeated the Philistines' secret weapon of Goliath. Now you may be thinking, it wasn't David's mindset that defeated Goliath, it was the power of God. I totally agree that it was the power of God that defeated Goliath. But what stopped Saul from depending on that power? What stopped every one of his mighty men of valor from depending on that power? What helped David to depend on that power? His mindset, his way of thinking. Today, we're going to talk about the mindset that we need to be able to defeat our worst enemy. An enemy bigger than Goliath. An enemy stronger than Goliath. An enemy more destructive than Goliath. What's his name? It depends. What's your name? Many times we are our own worst enemy. The one who would stop us and hinder us most from reaching the potential that God would have for us is us. It's our pride, our ego, our sin nature. So, exactly how strong is this enemy? How can we see when he's rearing his ugly head? How is it we can make sure that we are not defeated by our enemy? How can we make sure that we gain the victory over this enemy? And why is he so strong? This is what we're going to be learning today. But first, and then that's when I would introduce visitors and pray and all that. All right? Now, probably from the beginning, pretty early on, I imagine you were able to figure out that I was talking about David and Goliath. How many of you knew I was talking about David and Goliath before I said, enter Goliath? Nobody? Okay. Okay. Some people know, some people don't. And things are going on in the minds of the different people. The people who don't know are wondering, what's he talking about? Where's he going with this? The people who do know are kind of like, ooh, he's talking about David and Goliath. But why is he doing it this way? I wonder who else knows. Does Gabby know he's talking about David and Goliath? Does Mark know he's talking about David? And I don't know why, but it seems more interesting to the person when they know that they know what it is, but other people may not know what we're talking about. And that just makes it more interesting. Okay? But then, where was the twist? What was the thing that you were not expecting?
The enemy?
Who the enemy was. When I start saying about this enemy that's bigger, stronger, more destructive than Goliath, who do you think most people are going to think that is?
Devil.
The devil. I was not talking about the devil. Who was I talking about? Ourselves. That is how to take a very well-known Bible story and still have a twist, still have intrigue. The intrigue for the people who know the Bible story is who else is realizing what he's talking about and why is he telling it in this way? And then the twist was the application, that I was not talking about the enemy of the devil. I was talking about ourselves and how we have to defeat our own flesh. And that's what the sermon was all about. And that was a sermon that got so much good feedback. Like Pastor Velez had told me, Valentin, I always get good feedback, from your sermons, but not like this. And he doesn't remember specifically what they said, but I believe he said that you remember that they remembered all the different points I was talking about. Okay? And that's what, when you preach a sermon, you want the people to receive what you're saying. You want them to be able to remember what you're teaching. And the best way to do that is first captivate their attention with the introduction. Because I had been preaching for years before that, and I'd never gotten that kind of feedback before. I'd always, like he said, I'd always gotten good feedback, but not like that. And that's when I realized that it really works. Captivating their attention at first really gets people listening, and actually, if it's with a story, it gets them co-creating the story with you, and they're actively participating in the introduction and then in the sermon as well. And that's why they remember so much more. All right? And that's our time for today. Next time we'll talk about some other types of stories and other ways to do that.
The guy who was doing the speech about the introduction, what are the three ones that he said?
The first one was a question that matters to the audience. He said that would be the third best way, and that's what I've learned is actually the best way to end your introduction. The second was with a fact that shocks, some kind of fact that is hard to believe. And then the third one was with a story. And that was, that was the best way, which I agree. And every once in a while, I don't do a story because I just don't have a story that goes with it as well as either a factoid. And then I've learned some other ways also that we'll talk about in other classes.
But you didn't put the factoid in your story.
I started with the factoid and then I had story elements. It wasn't exactly a story, but I had story elements afterwards to help captivate the attention and keep the attention.